Hook. In May 1904, on an ordinary afternoon in Paris, 7 men sat down in a room and signed a document that would change sports forever. They had no sponsors, no television, no billions of dollars. They had only a ball and one idea: to make football belong to the entire world. What was born that day became the most powerful sports organization in history. But behind that story of greatness, there are wars, betrayals, and secrets that official football history doesn't like to talk about. Stay until the end, because what happened in Chapter 7 will change the way you see the World Cup forever. The world of football in 1904. To understand why FIFA was created, you need to picture football at the beginning of the 20th century. It was a sport growing like wildfire. England had invented the rules decades earlier, and the game had crossed oceans and mountain ranges, reaching France, Belgium, Switzerland, and beyond. But every country played by its own version of the rules. Standards varied from place to place. There was no official international tournament. When teams from different countries faced each other, arguments broke out over which rules to follow, who would referee, and how to count the score. It was organized chaos. And it was precisely out of that chaos that the need for a governing body was born. Someone had to define the rules of the game, not just on the pitch, but off it too. And that someone would turn out to be a small group of visionaries who, in 1904, decided to act. By the end of this video, you will understand why that decision was far more political than it was sporting. The day FIFA was born. On May 21, 1904, at the headquarters of the Union of French Athletic Sports in Paris, representatives of 7 countries signed the document that created the Fédération Internationale de Football Association, FIFA. The founding countries were France, Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland. Notice one important detail. England, the country that invented modern football, was not there. The English believed an international organization was unnecessary. They thought their rules were sufficient and that they needed no one to dictate how the sport should work. That pride would cost them dearly later on. The first president of FIFA was the Frenchman Robert Guérin, a journalist who believed football needed a single voice in the world. The position was voluntary, the budget was practically zero, and the challenges were enormous. But Guérin had something many underestimated: determination. What happened in the early years of FIFA, however, was far more turbulent than anyone could have predicted. The turbulent early years. In its early years, FIFA nearly disappeared. Without money, without real authority, and facing deep distrust from the British, the organization struggled to assert itself on the world stage. Robert Guérin resigned after just 2 years, frustrated by the lack of cooperation from the most powerful football nations. His replacement was the Englishman Daniel Woolfall, and ironically, it was a British official who saved FIFA during its most fragile years. Woolfall managed to bring England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland into the organization. With the British federations on board, FIFA gained credibility. Membership grew. The first internationally organized matches began to take place under the organization's banner. In 1908, football entered the Olympic Games in London for the first time as an official sport, a historic milestone that showed FIFA was gaining real strength. But that strength would be brutally tested when the world itself began to fall apart. The First World War and FIFA's survival. In 1914, the First World War erupted and football stopped. Players became soldiers. Stadiums became hospitals. FIFA entered a state of suspension. For 4 years, almost no international activity took place. When the war ended in 1918, the landscape was one of devastation, not only in cities and economies, but in the relationships between nations. FIFA had to rebuild everything from scratch. The winning countries wanted to expel Germany, Austria, and Hungary from the organization entirely. There were bitter disputes over who had the right to participate and who deserved to be punished. In that climate of tension and resentment, a man emerged who would define the future of world football: Jules Rimet. Appointed FIFA president in 1921, Rimet had a dream that went far beyond sport. He wanted to use football as a tool for peace between nations. And to do that, he needed to create something nobody had ever attempted, a World Football Championship. The idea seemed impossible at the time, but Jules Rimet was not a man who gave up easily. The dream of the World Cup. Jules Rimet spent years convincing FIFA members that a World Championship was viable. In 1928, after long negotiations, the decision was finally made. The first World Cup would be held in 1930 in Uruguay. The choice was not random. Uruguay was a two-time Olympic football champion and had just celebrated 100 years of independence. The country committed to building a brand new stadium, covering the travel expenses of all participating teams, and guaranteeing prize money. It was an offer no other country was willing to make. But even so, traveling to South America in 1930 was no easy task. The ocean crossing by ship took weeks. Many European countries declined the invitation. In the end, only 4 European sides made the journey: France, Belgium, Romania, and Yugoslavia. The tournament happened regardless. 13 countries competed. Uruguay defeated Argentina in the final by 4-2 in front of 93,000 people at the Estadio Centenario. The world had its first ever champion. But what came next proved that football and politics would never travel separate roads. World Cup, war, and politics. The 1934 World Cup in Italy and the 1938 edition in France were both held under the shadow of European fascism. Mussolini used the Italian tournament as propaganda for his regime. Players were pressured into making fascist salutes before matches. FIFA, caught in a deeply uncomfortable position, chose not to intervene, a decision that would be criticized for decades to come. When the Second World War began in 1939, football stopped once again. The 1942 and 1946 World Cups were both canceled. For 12 years, the world went without a tournament. Jules Rimet used part of that period to protect the World Cup trophy, a solid gold cup that had become a symbol of global sport. With Nazi occupation spreading across Europe, he hid the trophy inside a shoebox under his bed in Rome to prevent it from being confiscated by German forces. A detail most people never know. The World Cup trophy survived the Second World War inside a simple bedroom, hidden as if it were just an ordinary object. In 1950, football returned with the World Cup in Brazil, and the world game would never be the same again. FIFA's global expansion. After 1950, FIFA entered a phase of explosive growth. New countries from Africa, Asia, and Central America began joining the organization. Football was transforming from a predominantly European and South American sport into something truly global. In 1974, Brazilian João Havelange became FIFA president, defeating Englishman Stanley Ruse in a historic vote that shifted the balance of power away from Europe for the first time. Havelange promised to expand the World Cup to include more developing nations, and he delivered. The tournament grew from 16 to 24 teams, and eventually to 32. But that expansion came with a price. Havelange brought giant sponsors like Adidas and Coca-Cola into the FIFA ecosystem. Money began flowing in quantities nobody had seen before. And where enormous amounts of money meet limited oversight, corruption rarely takes long to appear. What happened behind the scenes at FIFA during the following decades would eventually shock the entire world. Power, money, and the scandals. In 2015, the world of football was shaken by one of the biggest scandals in the history of sport. The American FBI arrested FIFA officials in Zurich, accusing them of accepting hundreds of millions of dollars in bribes in exchange for broadcasting rights and World Cup hosting decisions. Joseph Blatter, who had been FIFA president for 17 years, resigned just days after being re-elected to a 5th term. Michel Platini, one of the greatest players in European football history and the clear favorite to succeed him, was suspended and banned from the sport. FIFA's image, which had already been under scrutiny for decades, collapsed in the eyes of fans around the world. Investigations revealed a system of systematic corruption that had operated for decades, involving World Cup bids, multi-million-dollar contracts, and bribes distributed as casually as if they were standard business expenses. The question everyone was asking was simple. How had an organization created to protect football arrived at this point? The answer was buried in the very history you have just been watching: decades of concentrated power, limited transparency, and far too much money in the hands of far too few people. A legacy impossible to ignore. Despite all the scandals, FIFA's legacy is impossible to ignore. Today, the organization has 211 member countries, more than the United Nations itself, which has 193. The World Cup is the most watched sporting event on the planet. The 2022 final between Argentina and France was seen by more than 1.5 billion people around the world. Football has generated billions of dollars in economic activity, moved entire generations, and become the common language of nations that do not share a spoken tongue. Those 7 men who gathered in Paris in 1904 could not have imagined what they were setting in motion. They simply wanted to organize matches between different countries. What they actually founded was, in practice, one of the most powerful and controversial institutions of the 21st century. Football belongs to everyone, but FIFA still belongs to very few. And that tension, which began in that room in Paris over 100 years ago, remains the beating heart of the most popular sport the world has ever known. Outro. The story of FIFA is the story of football itself, with all its beauty and all its contradictions. If this video gave you a new perspective on the game, drop a like and subscribe. There is a lot more history like this on the way.